The death toll in Gaza continues to rise, with no sign of a let-up in hostilities. Paul Hirschson is a spokesman for the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Paul, thanks for joining us on the Cyprus News Digest. Can you tell us when this bombardment is going to stop?
This is an excellent question, and really the people who can answer that are the leadership of Hamas, because the reason that we're in this conflict is that they insisted on dragging us in against our will, and now that we're there, we're left with no choice but to pursue both arms of the military strategic layout of Hamas, the rockets and the terror tunnels. We didn't want to be here in the first place. I think everybody knows that. And we accepted the 3 ceasefire proposals and implemented them, all of which were ignored by Hamas. So we're in a very, very difficult situation, one we didn't want to be in, but there is an obligation that every country has to its public, and that is to protect them and to ensure security.
And how does the blockade in Gaza ensure security in the area?
Well, to be fair, of course, there is no blockade. What there is a naval blockade. The naval blockade was put in place quite a while ago, a few years ago, was ruled legal and legitimate by the United Nations, and it was put there precisely because we find ourselves in a situation where the Gaza Strip is ruled by a murderous, monstrous organization who puts at the very focus of its activities the desire and the attempt, and in too many cases the success of murdering any Israeli or Jew that they can get their hands on. It was put in place in order to prevent the importing of weaponry, but of course it was ruled legal and legitimate by the United Nations. In terms of the
Sorry,
land,
hang on a minute, Paul. When you say it was ruled legal, you're talking now about the nautical limit. But that was originally set at 20 nautical miles and then over time reduced. And I think that at the end of the last Gaza war, it was down to 3 nautical miles. That doesn't allow a great deal of hope for the fishermen, and I think there are over 3,000 of them in the area.
This is a very difficult situation. I agree with you, and this is precisely what the people of Gaza have to suffer at the hands of one of the darkest political regimes in modern history. Look, let's make no mistake, Hamas, these guys are cut of the same cloth as ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Boko Haram down in Nigeria stealing girls. God help us, I don't know what they're doing to them. And these are the people that the people of Gaza are living under. Nobody thinks for a moment that this is an easy life for them.
Why was it that the Israeli government, as I understood it, it was being blamed in Israel because it failed to prevent the international community from recognizing the unity deal between Hamas and Fatah? Now, if you were dealing with a single unity government, then surely it would be possible to come to some arrangement. But it seems that since you didn't recognise that unity deal, this latest escalation has actually been a godsend for Netanyahu's government, hasn't it?
No, it's been a disaster. It's been an absolute disaster for everybody. First and foremost for the Palestinians. Look, there is a difference between a unity government, a Palestinian unity government for peace, and a Palestinian unity government for murder. The international community has said, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, others have said Egypt as well, have said very clearly, Hamas is a terrorist organization. If they recognize Israel, if they renounce violence, and if they accept prior agreements legally binding both on Israel and on the Palestinians, then it's a whole different ballgame.
And does that mean that then this blockade would be lifted? Because basically you're starving these people out, aren't you?
No, not at all. Look, the blockade is a naval blockade exclusively.
Well, it's not a naval blockade. They can't get across the crossings, Paul. They can't get out of Gaza, and Israel keeps saying you must leave, but it doesn't actually tell them how they're going to leave and where they're going to go.
No, that's not true. There are 2 separate issues here. First of all, with the exception of the past 2 weeks, of course, where there's been fighting and things have been a difference. But before that, there was zero limitation on exports. Zero limitation on exports. There were very limited limitations on imports, and as it turns out, we've seen exactly what they've done with the imports, which is take it all and pour it underground in the at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, at the expense of the welfare of their own people, in building terror tunnels. And don't forget, of course, that they share a border with Egypt. Israel doesn't actually have the physical ability to put a blockade on, because they are welcome whether we like it or not. In many cases we don't.
No, but you've built a wall, haven't you?
Or weapons.
You've built a wall to keep them in and stop them getting out into Israel.
Well, no, you're talking about a small part of the security barrier between Israel and the West Bank. We're talking about the Gaza Strip, where there's no wall, there is a fence, but it's our international frontier. I don't know what we're supposed to do other than build 30 years ago, I think it was, it was less than that, to be fair, a security barrier between ourselves and the other side of our sovereign territory. The idea that the Palestinians, or at least the murderers from Hamas, should be free to cross at will into Israel doesn't hold water. I mean,
Paul, sorry, let me interrupt again for a moment, because actually the bottom line here seems to be that when you kettle a group of people, and in this case a nation, into a small area, and you deny them control over their water supply and their electricity. When today the humanitarian agencies of the UN, I think, said that the food and water was now running out. This, forgive me, sounds very much like the Warsaw Ghetto in World War II. Now, during that, the Jews used tunnels and the sewer system to smuggle in vital supplies and to attack their oppressors. It now seems to many people that with the boot on the other Palestinian foot, you're suggesting that this is unacceptable behaviour. Isn't that hypocrisy?
If I may, the analogy is a little disgraceful. But you yourself point out that in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews used tunnels to smuggle in food, whereas over here, what Hamas is doing is smuggling weapons in the opposite direction across an international frontier in order to murder children. So just to put things in perspective...
Sorry, who's murdering children, Paul, at the moment? The death toll in the last 2 weeks is how many Palestinian children?
Way too many, and the responsibility for that lies directly at the doorstep of Hamas.
They didn't fire the bullets or shoot the guns, did they?
We will probably discover, as we usually do, that a significant amount of those bullets were fired exactly by Hamas, yes. You know very well that they're using human shields, they are behaving in a cynical fashion, they're using child soldiers, which in itself is a war crime, and as usually happens, numbers are thrown around in a rather distasteful way, which as time goes by get adjusted and a real picture comes out. We already know that something approaching 250 of the dead are confirmed Hamas terrorists, and to be fair, also Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We know
so that's about a third of the dead, which ties up with the UN figures, which say at the moment that 74% of those killed in Gaza are civilians, and that medical clinics are among the facilities hit by airstrikes. In fact, if I'm correct, I think Navi Pillay has said that there is possibly an investigation to be done into war crimes.
Oh, I would recommend to Navi Pillay to tread carefully. I think that she and the Human Rights Council risk embarrassing themselves even more than they did last time when the Goldstone report came out, and Judge Goldstone was eventually forced to turn around and apologize in embarrassment and say that the entire investigation was a farce. It's almost a sense of deja vu, where we begin to wonder whether the United Nations Human Rights Council is still being run by Muammar Gaddafi. Of course, we know he's dead, so that can't be the case. But it seems to be that at the moment. I suggest that we address this trade in blood, this game of numbers, with a little bit of hesitation before we pronounce. Experience shows us that as time goes by, when real numbers come out, we start to understand a far different picture to that one which you just presented.
Okay, let me ask you this, Paul, if I may. Israel does say that it is trying to prevent civilian casualties by giving warnings to people to leave. Do you seriously now think that a 1-minute warning by text message or a warning bomb on somebody's roof immediately prior to a strike actually absolves Israel of responsibility in the deaths that ensue?
Well, let me ask you, do you honestly believe that that's the case? I mean, really?
Well, we've seen it. We've watched film footage from international news agencies of the bomb on the roof followed within less than a minute by a strike. In fact, one nearly hit a UN water lorry.
Absolutely. Look, that is absolutely not the case, and you're fully aware of that. For 3 days, we begged the residents of Shajaiya to move out. We told them which areas they should go to, which would not be dangerous areas. We leafleted the place for 3 days. We phoned hundreds of thousands of phone calls, of text messages for 3 days. There was not a media channel in the world which did not report that Israel was warning this neighborhood and the other neighborhood. Everybody knew. The idea that you just presented, that there's a 30-second or a 1-minute warning in between one thing and another, is patently untrue and verges on laughable. It's simply not the case. The fact that the vast majority of the residents are paying attention to the warnings that we get, that they are getting, despite both warnings and instructions from Hamas to ignore the warnings that they are being received, is clear evidence of the fact that Israel and the Israeli military has taken unprecedented steps, has probably set a new standard for militaries around the world as to what to do under very difficult circumstances. Let's not pretend that these are easy circumstances. Hamas is hiding behind its deliberately its own civilians.
And is that why you're using flechette weapons and bombs as well? Because those would be certain, wouldn't they, to kill the civilians behind whom Hamas, you say, is hiding, rather than the people behind the human shield?
I cannot speak to operational considerations, but I can tell you this. The Israeli military works 100% within the dictates of international humanitarian law. We welcome you to come and to check and to understand the reality of the situation, and I guarantee that you will come to that conclusion.
All right. Mahmoud Abbas has said that agreement can be reached if there's an opening of the border crossings, and he said ending all forms of aggressions. That presumably means an end to the rocket attacks. Is Israel, which has obviously got the upper hand here, going to insist that the rocket attacks stop first before it will give some semblance of dignity to the people of Palestine?
Well, some semblance of dignity to the people of Palestine. We redeployed out of the Gaza Strip 9 years ago in the hope that they would build a Dubai on the Mediterranean, and instead what they've been doing is shooting themselves in the foot repetitively for some years now. When you talk about the opening of the borders, I believe that what Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas even more so in particular are talking about are the border crossings between Gaza and Egypt that we have no control over. It's not our decision. This is a very difficult scenario.
You work very closely with Egypt. They wouldn't agree to it unless you probably told them that it was okay.
I think that's a little bit misleading to imagine for a second that the sovereign country of Egypt just is waiting for instructions from us. That isn't quite exactly.
I don't think that's what I said, but you do work very closely with Egypt on all these issues, and you have said, I believe, that you want them to be involved in any ceasefire negotiations.
I think that we have to remember that as far as the Egyptians are concerned, Hamas is a terrorist organization, that Hamas just a few months ago murdered 20 or 30 Egyptian police officers and soldiers. I think that, Egypt has its own decision-making process and its own feelings and thoughts vis-a-vis the people in Hamas. I don't think that it has that much to do with our relationship with Egypt. They have their own very poor relationship with Hamas, all because of the way Hamas behaves. It's not only the Palestinians that Hamas is abusing, and it's not only the Israelis that Hamas is trying to murder. They have an agenda which is bigger than that.
All right, and finally, the airlines, Paul. There have been several EU and US airlines that have stopped landing in Tel Aviv, and I believe that President Netanyahu has asked John Kerry to lift the ban. Now, this happens just days after the Malaysian plane was shot down over Ukraine, which called into question the advisability of exposing passengers to potential risks in conflict zones. How can Israel guarantee the safety of airlines if they do fly to Tel Aviv?
Well, it is a fantastic question. First of all, I don't think there's been anybody in Israel who hasn't asked themselves the rhetorical question, what on earth would happen were Hamas to get their hands on surface-to-air missiles? And it's precisely the reason why we have said the Gaza Strip needs to be demilitarized, and why just the day before yesterday, all 28 members of the European Union collectively put out an official statement saying that the European Union and all 28 of its members insist that Hamas be disarmed. But just to speak to the specifics, of course, you probably know that the Federal Aviation Authority today rescinded the restriction on flights to Israel. Flights are starting again. Everybody's back. Business is open as usual. There is a 100% cast iron guarantee of the security of planes coming into and out of Israel. The Federal Aviation Authority would never have rescinded the ban had they thought anything else.
All right, Paul Hirschson, thank you very much indeed for your time and for joining me on the programme.
Thank you, my pleasure, anytime.
That was Paul Hirschson, spokesman from the Israeli Foreign Ministry.